everyone, welcome back. This is Macroeconomics. So in the previous lessons, we talked about the measures of aggregate outputs of the country, which is what we call GDP. And today we are going to go over the difference between the real GDP and nominal GDP. So in general, we use GDP to measure the overall size of the economy. And we would like to compare GDP across time in order to track the economic growth. However, there is a problem. As we mentioned before, the calculations of GDP is coming from two factors: the quantity of the products being sold in the economy and the price that is charged in the economy. Well, we know from time to time, prices will change in the economy. Inflations and deflations happen. Therefore, real GDP is basically used to calculate the overall output of the country by adjusting those price changes. So real GDP adjusts and account for the inflations and deflations, but nominal GDP is referred to the GDP only using the price at the time of the measurement. And we're going to see some examples. Well, in the calculations, we are going to set a year as in our calculations for the real GDP, and that particular year can be any time period. As long as you set that year in your calculations, we will call this the base year. Here's an example. We have 2 years of outputs from a simple economy setting, where this economy only produced tuna, carrot juice, and X-ray exam. So we want to actually track how much the economy is actually growing from the year of 2010 to 2015, given the quantity of each goods and the price of each goods. If we are going to calculate the nominal GDP, well, in the year of 2015, we are going to use the total quantity of tuna, which is 30 units, times the price of each unit, which is $7, and that's basically $210 for total productions of tuna. For carrot juice, we have total of 165, and X-ray examinations is 1,200 in the year of 2015. Once we sum all this production's value, we will be able to get the nominal GDP in 2015, which is 1,575. You can also take a look at the GDP calculations for 2010 to see if you can actually calculate the nominal GDP in 2010. Well, the total productions in 2010, it's basically 20 units times $5, which is $100, and 50 units times $2, which is another $100, and 10 times $80, which is $800. So the nominal GDP in 2010 adds up to $1,000. Now the question is, if we are going to compare the nominal GDP in 2010, which is 1,000, to the nominal GDP in 2015, which is $1,575, there might be a misunderstanding of how much the economy has grown. The reason is because the economy did not grow by $575 between the two periods. Well, the reason why we believe we are not making accurate measurements here to compare the 2 years, it's because the price of each goods actually change in the 2 periods. Remember, GDP measured the overall outputs of the countries. If price is going to determine the value of the goods, and the value of the goods actually reflects only by the price, not the growth of the productions, then obviously we are not measure the actual outputs correctly. Therefore, in order to adjust for those price changes, we are going to use real GDP to compare the two time periods. In this example, we're going to set the real GDP using the base year in 2010. In fact, when you have time, you can definitely try to set the base year in 2015 and reverse the calculations and try to see if you get the same result. So, the real GDP in 2010 will be exactly the same as the nominal GDP in 2010. The reason is, when we are trying to calculate the real GDP in 2010, what we do is using the quantity of each goods times the price in the base year, which is 2010. So therefore, the real GDP in 2010 is still $1,000. In 2015, to calculate the real GDP using the base year of 2010, we are going to use the quantity of each good, tuna 30, carrot juice 55, and X-ray examinations 12, multiply by, well, the price in the base year, in this case, which is 2010. So therefore, the total outputs in 2015 for tuna will be 30 units times $5, the $5 coming from the year of 2010. Carrot juice will be 55 times $2, and X-ray examinations 12 times $80. Well, in this case, if we are going to sum the total of the three items, we will get the real GDP in 2015 using the base year of 2010, which adds to $1,220. Now, why are we using the real GDP instead of nominal GDP comparing the two periods? If we use the nominal GDP, again, because the price can change, and we do not know the growth of that number is coming from the price, or is that actually coming from the change of the quantity of each goods. And as a result, by comparing the real GDP, we will get a much more accurate result. Because now the prices that we use to calculate the real GDP in both periods or multiple periods will be exactly the same. The only change in those periods will only be the quantity of each good. So now we can actually make conclusions. In the years of 2015, this country actually produced $220 worth of goods more than the year of 2010. Well, overall, if you take a look at some of the data that we got from United Kingdoms, so this graph actually representing the real GDP and nominal GDP in 2000 in the United Kingdom from the year of 1979 to 2012. Obviously, you can see the blue line is representing the nominal GDP and the orange line is representing the real GDP in UK. And you can see that there is a point where the real GDP and the nominal GDP actually intersect with each other, which is in the year of 2009. And that's an indication that 2009 is the base year in these calculations. Again, a little note for you to understand how this graph is actually formed. Whenever you get the same number of real GDP and nominal GDP, you can be very certain that is the year that the base year is being set for the calculations of the real GDP. Whenever the real GDP is above the nominal GDP, for example, from the year of 1979 all the way down to 2009, you can see that the orange line is always above the blue lines. And that basically means the price levels in the current periods is lower than the base year periods. So the blue line represents the prices in the current periods, and the orange line reflects the price level in the base year periods. So therefore, this graph also tells us something about the inflations overall in the UK. When the blue line is actually above the orange line, that basically means the current price level is higher than the base time, the base periods or base year that we use to calculate the real GDP. Well, one thing that's very important for a student to understand about real GDP and nominal GDP is that sometimes when you're reading articles, especially when the article is showing you a graph similar to this one, it could be very confusing of what you're looking at. Well, in some journals or articles, or maybe newspaper journals, it's very often the case that the journal is reporting the nominal GDP, like the yellow graph that I'm showing you here. Well, when you look at the nominal GDP in this graph, you might think that the country actually has a really successful growth over the years. Again, can we compare nominal GDP across time? And of course, the answer is no. And therefore, if you look at the real GDP graph, which is the blue lines, it basically demonstrates the country, it does not result in any growth over the periods of 2000 to 2013. So this graph is actually a representation of the GDP growth in Venezuela in South Americans. So some of the journal actually represents this graph with nominal GDP, trying to indicate how successfully Venezuela actually grew in that period of time. But in fact, that is not the case. What actually happened in Venezuela, based on this graph, we don't see a successful growth of real GDP during this period in the country, but instead, the country actually has a really high inflation rate across this period from the 2000 and 2013. Therefore, if you are misunderstanding the comparisons of the two, or you are confused about the nominal GDP and real GDP definitions, when you're reading journals or articles, it's very easy for you to get confused about what is being presented. So again, the problem in Venezuela is high inflations during this time period. And that drives the nominal GDP really, really high, even without producing more goods, but the prices keep going up and driving every value of the goods higher. Another very useful calculations in GDP topic is what we call the per capita GDP or GDP per capita. So when we measure the growth of the country, of course, we are trying to use the real GDP change or the real GDP growth rate to represent how the country actually getting more successful or maybe increase in size. However, the GDP per capita measure actually give you a much more in-depth understanding of how the wealth actually relates to the size of the populations. So GDP per capita actually give you the measure of average income of the individuals in the economy. Given an example here, we have a country that has a real GDP of $100 million, and the populations in this country is 50,000 people. To calculate the real GDP per capita, we basically use the real GDP, which is $100 million, divided by the total populations of the country, which is 50,000 people. And therefore, as a result, we know on average, every individual in the economy should, if this is evenly distributed to the populations, everyone should have at least $2,000 worth of goods and services received it in this economy per capita. So this is a very, very important things that most social scientists would take attention to. So again, well, this will come back to us later when we try to do some calculations practice. So this is not a difficult equation to remember, but hopefully it makes sense to most of you guys. Again, once we have the real GDP calculated, now we can actually use the two real GDP to calculate the growth rates of the economy. So to calculate any growth rate, well, the equation is pretty much the same. So in this case, to calculate the growth rate of the real GDP, we are going to use the current year of real GDP, usually is the most current year, minus the previous period's year real GDP, and then divided by the previous year real GDP. Of course, if you want to change this to a percentage point, then you can multiply this by 100%. Given an example, we have the real GDP in 2018, which is $100 million, and the real GDP in 2019, which is $110 million. We're going to use the most current year in 2019 minus the previous period, which is 2018. So we use $110 million minus $100 million and divided by the previous period, which is $100 million, and multiply by 100%. And this results in 10% of growth in this particular country. And that also indicates the economy actually produced 10% more goods and services for people to purchase or enjoy it. Well, we have talked so much about the GDP topics, and now we would like to actually switch to an interesting measure that most people might have heard before. This term, GNP, or Gross National Product, might be presented in many different articles or maybe newspaper. So you might be interested to find out what's the difference between GDP and GNP. So the major difference between the GDP and GNP is actually relates on how we count the productions take place either outside or outside the country. So the GDP only counts whatever productions that take place in the country, within the border. Even though there is a foreign country decided to make their productions in the country of United States, let's say Sony, a Japanese game console productions industry, if they decided to produce their PS5 in the United States, and that units that they produce in the United States will be counted as the US GDP. However, GNP is the reverse. GNP basically counts anything that produced by the residents of that country, including the overseas productions. So in this case, if something is produced by the citizen, let's say Apple. Apple is a country that owned by the US citizens, and anything that produced and sold in the market by Apple, well, those will be counted towards the GNP. However, if you think about the productions of Apple taking place in China, well, that is not part of the GDP, but only count towards the GNP. Maybe this is a little bit confusing for someone out there. So let's use some example to demonstrate. So let's try to think about what are the following types of productions will count towards the GDP of the United States or the GNP of the United States. Well, first, we have Toyota production taking place in the US. So Toyota is a Japanese-owned company. So they are not the US citizens company. So therefore, when we are counting the productions of Toyota take place in the US, this is automatically within the US border, so therefore it is automatically the GDP calculations. So again, if the Toyota production takes place in the United States, it automatically count as a GDP, but it won't count as GNP because, well, Toyota is not owned by the US citizens. Well, Apple's productions in China. Well, since this production does not take place in the United States, so it automatically eliminates the GDP calculations. Therefore, any production that takes place in China can only be considered to take part in the GNP of the United States. Again, the reason why it counts towards GNP because Apple is owned by the US citizens. And Ford again is a US citizen-owned company, and therefore anything that they produce should count towards GNP. When the production is taking place in Mexico, even, it should always count towards the US GNP calculations. Volkswagen productions taking place in the US. Well, Volkswagen is not a US company. Volkswagen is a Germany-owned company, and therefore it doesn't count towards GNP at all. However, because the production is taking place in the US, and therefore it counts towards GDP calculations. Nike productions taking place in Vietnam. Again, Nike is a US citizen-owned company. Since the production does not take place in the US, so therefore it cannot count towards GDP of the US. But because the Nike company is owned by the US citizens, so therefore the productions will count towards GNP. Now, maybe a little challenge for questions for you guys to answer. What if Amazon is producing a new machines in the United States? Well, does that count towards GDP or GNP? Well, what do you think? I would like to leave this question for you to think about, and maybe when you can answer that questions on your own, you can now fully understand what's different between GDP and GNP. Well, hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next ones.